How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yud, Daf 10 of Masechtas Zevachim. Friends, on today's Daf, we have 3 sections. Section number 1 is Mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda. Very interesting stuff because it's kind of applying like piggle phrase, like structure, piggle structure to Lishma. Of course, we learned a bit about piggle in our introduction to Masechta Zevachim, and we are going to bring some piggle thinking to Lishma. So we will start off learning about that, and we will explain what that means when we jump in. And then, so that'll really be like the first half of today's daf. And the second half, slaughtering an asham shelo lishma, givaldi. If you remember in the Mishnah, of course, we learned about chatos and korban pesach shelo lishma. But if you remember back from daf, was it daf hey? Where we had been talking, well, not, this is really where we start talking about it, but it had come up, let's just say, in the past. Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, already back from the Mishnah and Daf Beis, the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, that add to the list chatos, korban pesach, and asham. So Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is that if a korban asham is slaughtered shelo lishma, it also is possible, and we are going to jump into that and understanding that. And Rabbi Eliezer's opinion there, Zerikas hadam for shlomim. Okay, that is going to be the last sugya on today's daf, talking about the Zerikas hadam of korban shlomim, specifically which part of the mizbeach it's Zerikas hadam on. So that is what we have on our plates for today. Let us enjoy ourselves and learn some Masechta Zevachim. Okay, friends, we are going to begin on Daf Tes Amid Beis, 4 lines from the bottom. Itmark. It was stated Shchota lishma lizrok dama shelo lishma. Rabbi Yechon Omar Psula v'Rishlakish Omar Kshera. Rabbi Yechon Omar Psula Mechashvin aveda laveda ve'afin machshavas piggle. Rishlakish Omar Kshera ein Mechashvin aveda laveda ve'loi ve'afin machshavas piggle. Okie dokie. Bum, 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 da, 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 da. Okay. So, Chevre, who remembers what piggle is? We're not going to get too into piggle, but just conceptually, who can explain to us what piggle is? So, if you remember from the introduction to Masechtas Zevachim, piggle is be'etzem, without getting into the details of it, I'll just give one example of piggle, which is that, or whatever, the example that's actually, I'll just give the one example that would be most relevant for our sugya. So if somebody were to, it's actually also going to come up a little bit later on Daf Yud Amud Aleph, if someone were to slaughter a korban, let's just say a korban chatos, it shouldn't really matter, but let's say somebody slaughters so Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban chatos, with the intention of doing the Zerikas hadam for Reuven's korban chatos after the allotted zman. Zerikas hadam has to be done that day before Shkia. Aharon has in mind, as he's slaughtering Reuven's korban chatos, that he's going to do the Zerikas hadam at night, which is too late. That's piggle. That's what's called chutz lizmano, and that is piggle. There's also a very similar scenario that we also talked about in the introduction, which is also going to come up on today's daf, not in any kind of deep way, but just kind of more like in a referencing way, is chutz lim komo. If Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban chatas with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam, let's say outside of the Beis Hamikdash, he's got some altar in his backyard or something. He's going to take the dam, take it to his backyard altar, and do Zerikas hadam there. So that would be chutz lim komo. Okay, so basically, so of course by piggle, going back to piggle, which is chutz lizmanu. So of course, if Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban chatas with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam tonight, which is too late, so that's of course piggle. So that's possible. The question is, does that structure apply to lishma as well? The shayla therefore is, if a harik slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas, and all is good, but he has intention at the time that he's slaughtering Ruvain's korban chatas that he's going to be doing Zerikas hadam for an ola, not for chata, but for an ola. So of course, if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas as an ola, well, that of course is shelo lishma, and that's going to be possible. But if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas as a korban chatas, but with the intention of doing the Zerikas hadam as an ola, now what? If we employ the kind of pigul perspective, we would say, well, pigul is that you slaughter a korban with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam chutz lizmano, and that's pigul, that's aser. So if we employ that over here, we would say, Aharon slaughtering Ruvain's korban chatas with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam for an ola, that would be possible. But if we say, ein mechashvin me'avoda lavoda, that we're not going to apply, we're not going to be able to, well, mechashvin, to think, right, to have an improper kavana from one avoda to the next, well, then we're not going to make the connection to pigul. We're not going to apply the pigul way of seeing things. So that's the question over here. Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban chatos with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam for an ola. The question is that kosher or is it pasul? Rabbi Yochanan says pasul. Rish Lakish says kosher. Let's read it inside. It was stated, Shchata lishma lizrok dama shelo lishma. Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban chatos lishma, but there's a catch. He had kavana to do Zerikas hadam. Wait, did I? Yeah, okay, lishma, right? L'shem chatos, but there's a catch. He had kavana to do Zerikas hadam shelo lishma, i.e., l'shem ola. Let's say. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Psula. Rabbi Yochanan says Psula v'Rish Lakish Amar Ksher. So Rabbi Yochanan says pasul. Rish Lakish says kosher. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Psula. Why does Rabbi Yochanan say pasul? Because Mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda. Because we can have improper thoughts from one avoda to another avoda. Of course, there are 4 avodas: Shrita, Kabbalah, Olacha, Zrika. From one avoda to another avoda, you can have an improper thought. So therefore, while doing Shrita, having an improper thought regarding Zrika, that you're going to do it the shem ola, that is going to be problematic. V'yalfinan mimachsheves pigul, and this is learned from pigul. Just like you slaughter a korban with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam chutz lizmano, so also you slaughter the korban chatos with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam as let's say an ola. That is going to be problematic. Rish Lakish Omar Ksheiri. Rish Lakish says that the korban is kosher because ein mechashvin me'aveda la'aveda. We do not have thoughts from one of the avodas to another avodas. And mazel tov that you had kavana when slaughtering Ruvain's korban chatas, they're going to do Zerikas hadam for an ola. It's not going to make it pasul. V'lo yalfinu mimachshavas pigul. We are not going to be learning out from pigul. Yes, it's great that by pigul having one machshava by shrita for what you're going to do by zrika can cause problems. It cannot cause problems by lishma. Okay, mamish a gewalt. That is the machlokes in Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish with regard to mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda in the context of lishma. Ve'azdu l'taimayu, and Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish are consistent with their perspectives. The idmar that it was stated, this is in the context of avodah zarah. Hashoichet esa beima, a person who slaughters a korban, an animal. Person slaughters an animal outside of the Beis Hamikdash in his backyard. He slaughters a sheep. Amanas lizrik dam la'avodas kucham. So he hasn't yet done Zerikas hadam for avodah zarah. He hasn't thrown the blood of the sheep on the mizbeach for avodah zarah, but he's slaughtering this sheep and doing the shechita with the intention that he's going to do Zerikas hadam, he's going to throw the blood of the sheep on an altar for avodah zarah, or to burn its fats for avodah zarah, right? So he's thinking at the time of shchita for haktara, which comes after zerika. But when it comes to pigul, that's also one of the things, right? If you slaughter a korban by pigul, if you slaughter a korban with the intention of doing zerikas hadam, chutz lizmanu, or haktara semurin, chutz lizmanu, or achilas hakorban, chutz lizmanu. So here also, he's slaughtering an animal with the intention of throwing its blood on an altar for avodah zarah, or burning its fats on an altar for avodah zarah. Rabbi Yechanan Omer asura. Rabbi Yechanan says this animal is also it's avodah zarah. Mechashvin me'aveda la'aveda, because you can have improper thoughts from one avodah to another avodah, from, for example, slaughtering the sheep to throwing its blood on the altar. And we learn outside of the Beis Hamikdash stuff from inside of the Beis Hamikdash stuff, right? Just like in the Beis Hamikdash there's pigul, so also outside of the Beis Hamikdash in context such as this, like slaughtering an animal to do Zerikas hadam for avodah zarah. And Rabbi Yechanan says that just like in the Beis Hamikdash there's pigul, so here also there is trouble when being mechashvin me'aveda la'aveda. Rish Lakish Omar says Rish Lakish muteres, the animal, it's fine. You didn't do Zerikas hadam with the animal for avodah zarah. You slaughtered the animal with a kavanah that you were going to do Zerikas hadam for avodah zarah, but that kavanah is not that with that kavanah, right? Kavanah at the time of shchita for zrika, Mutaris, the korban is going to be fine. The animal is going to be fine. Because we don't have improper thoughts from one avoda to another avoda, from shchita to zrika, for example. And we don't learn outside of the Beis Hamikdash from inside of the Beis Hamikdash. Sure, inside the Beis Hamikdash there's pigul, but we don't apply similar structures to outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Now add the word utzriche, and we need both scenarios. We need the scenario of mechashvin me'aveda la'aveda by lishma. We also need mechashvin me'aveda, the sugya of mechashvin, or the context of mechashvin me'aveda la'aveda by avodah zarah. How come? If we only have the case, I think of avodah zarah, it'll become clear in a second. Rish Lakish, is by avodah zarah, where Rish Lakish says ein mechashvin me'aveda la'aveda, because it's outside of the Beis Hamikdash, right? Meaning the most similar issue the most similar thing that's definitely usher is pigul, and pigul is in the Beis Hamikdash. This avodah zarah scenario is happening outside the Beis Hamikdash. So, okay, I can understand there why Rish Lakish concludes ein mechashvin me'aveda la'aveda aval pnim mipnim. But if we're talking about lishma, we're talking about a korban in the Beis Hamikdash, that Aharon is slaughtering Reuven's korban chatas with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam l'shem ola. Well, ema modi later Rabbi Yochanan. Maybe in that case, in the Beis Hamikdash, Rish Lakish would agree with Rabbi Yochanan that it is also that is possible. And if we would only have the scenario of mechashvin me'aveda la'aveda by lishma, Rabbi Yechanan, that is where Rabbi Yechanan says possible in the Beis Hamikdash, by lishma. But by avodah zarah outside of the Beis Hamikdash, Rish Lakish, maybe you'll agree with Rish Lakish that taka ein mechashvin me'aveda la'aveda. Maybe the animal is okay by the avodah zarah because it's shchita with the intention of zrika. Maybe outside of the Beis Hamikdash we're not going to say mechashvin me'aveda la'aveda tzriche. So therefore we need both scenarios. We need the scenario of lishma in the Beis Hamikdash as well as avodah zarah outside of the Beis Hamikdash in order to say that both positions hold their positions. Rabbi Yochanan says possible in both cases. Rish Lakish says kosher in both cases. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babble, he said, Mosiv Rav Yirmiyah l'siyui l'Reb Yechanan, that Rav Yirmiyah has come to support Reb Yochanan, to bring support for Reb Yochanan. Reb Ila, the Surah Rish Lakish, and Reb Ila has come to bring support for Rish Lakish. Reb Yirmiyah, the Surah Reb Yochanan. Reb Yirmiyah has come to support Reb Yochanan that Mechashvin me'aveda la'aveda u'ma b'makim she'em omar areini shoichet chutz lizmanu cheva chutz lizmanu. What's chutz lizmanu? Pigul. If when it comes to pigul, if a person says, I'm going to slaughter this animal chutz lizmanu. So Rashi says something interesting there. Kind of to the right and a little bit above that. Hareini shoichet chutz lizmanu v'lo chishev amanas lechol v'lo amanas lizrok o lahaktir ela ala shchita chishev shtei chutz lizmanu kosher delab machshavei de'ein zman ela b'achilas adam u'mizbeach. That's what I was looking for. That the definition of pigul is when it comes to achilas adam o mizbeach, which is interesting. For it to be pigul, it has to be either the person consuming it, so a kavana with respect to eating the korban, or eating of the mizbeach, burning something, or Zerikas hadam is also considered the consuming of the mizbeach, but shchita, kabbalah, olacha, not. Anyways, so when it comes to pigul, if you slaughter a korban with the intention that you're slaughtering it chutz lizmano, which is kind of a funny intention because if it's not currently chutz lizmano, then you're not slaughtering it chutz lizmano. But anyways, the point is that chutz lizmano is irrelevant to the avoda at hand. Chutz lizmano only becomes relevant when you think about it for another avoda, right? Uma b'makim she'im omar hareini shoichet chutz lizmanu shu kosher. If a person slaughters an animal, and while slaughtering the animal, let's say it's Aharon slaughtering Reuven's korban chatos, and Aharon has kavana while he's slaughtering Reuven's korban chatos, that he's slaughtering it chutz lizmanu, whatever that means, the animal is kosher. Shchatu amanas lizrok damo chutz lizmanu posel. But if he does shchita, if Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban chatas with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam outside of the allotted time, well then it's posel. Well then makim shem amar shoichet shelo lishmo posel. Well then certainly in our case at hand, lishma by a korban chatas, if Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban chatos with the intention that he's slaughtering a korban ola, that already is posel. Right, by pigul, we said if Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban chatos with machshavas chutz lizmano, it won't make it posel. But by lishma, our case, posel. Well, then certainly, if he's doing it with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam as an ola, it's going to be posel, right? If in the case of pigul, where step 1 is kosher, right, doing the shchita chutz lizmano is kosher, but it's kind of step 2 is posel. Well, then in our case of lishma, we're already step 1. It's already posel from step 1. If you do the shchita with the kavanah of lo lishma, certainly then kind of step 2, which would be to do the shchita with the intention of doing the zrika shelo lishma as an ola, let's say, certainly that should be posel. Right, so let's read it one more time. Uma b'makom shem omer hareini shoichet chutz lizmanu shu kosher. Shchata amanas lizrok dam chutz lizmanu posel. Makom shem omer hareini shoichet shelo lishmo posel. When it comes to the shema, we're already the shchita itself. If he says, I'm going to shech this korban as an ola, this chatas as an ola, posel, well then certainly shchatu amenas lizrok damo, certainly if he does the shchita of the korban chatas with the intention to be doing the zrikas hadam shelo lishmo as in ola and udin sheyeh posel, certainly then it should be posel. Okay, that is Reb Yirmiyah's support for Reb Yochanan. Maskif la Rave bar Ahiloi. Rabbi Bar Ahiloi, however, asks a question on whether we can really bring a proof from pigul. Because after all, pigul is a chiyuv karis. Ma lechutz lizmanu shekein karis. That when it comes to chutz lizmanu, I can make the argument that by chutz lizmanu we could say mechashvin me'avoda le'avoda, that a kavana, an improper kavana for one avoda will negatively impact another avoda. Okay, we could say that by chutz lizmanu, which is pigul, which is a chiyuv karis. But by lishma, which is not a chiyuv karis, maybe we would not say mechashvin me'avoda. Rather, Rav bar Ahiloi gives his own suggestion. Because chutz lizmano is pigul, and that is chiyuv karis. But as we know already from the introduction to Masechta Zevachim, chutz limkomo, while it shares all of the same characteristics of chutz lizmano, just outside of its proper place rather than outside of its proper time. But there's a big difference between chutz lizmano and chutz limkomo. Chutz lizmano is pigul and it's a chiyuv karis. Chutz limkomo is a lav, and there's no chiyuv karis. So let's just use the same argument that we made for pigul, we'll make for chutz lizmano. And there's no chiyuv karis to say, well, chutz lizmano, for chutz limkomo. And there's no karis to make the argument that, well, chutz limkomo, there's a chiyuv karis. There isn't. This is the argument to be made for Reb Yochanan, that mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda u'ma b'makom she'im omar hareini shoichet chutz limkomo she'u kosher. If a Haran slaughters Ruvain's korban chatos with the intention that he's slaughtering it outside of the proper place, which is again a funny thought to have, because either it's in the proper place or it's, if it's in the proper place, it's in the proper place. If he's slaughtering it in the right place, so what does it mean that he has kavanah to slaughter it not in the right place? He's slaughtering it in the right place. Anyways, but it is kosher. Shchato amanas lizrok damo chutz limkomo. But if a Haran slaughters Reuven's korban chatos with the kavanah to do the Zerikas hadam outside of the allowed place, outside of the base, outside of the azara even, Posel, because mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda. So makom she'im omar arini shoichet shelo lishmo she'u posel. Well, then certainly by lishma, if a Haran slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas as a korban ola, it's already posel. Well, shchato amanas lizrok damu shelo lishmo enu din she'e posel. Well, then certainly, if a Haran slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam shelo lishmo, Zerikas hadam shelo lishmo, of course it would be possible, right? If by chutz lizmano, if by chutz lizmano, where the shchita itself, no, chutz limkomo. Sorry, if by chutz limkomo that the shchita itself with the kavanah of chutz limkomo is kosher, but to do Zerikas hadam chutz limkomo is possible. Certainly here by the shema, where the shchita itself is possible shelo lishma, certainly then to do, if it's the kavanah to do Zerika shelo lishma, it will be possible. But maskif la, Rav Ashi asks a question, man l'chutz limkomo shekein noyeg b'chol azvachim. But maybe I'll say that mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda applies to chutz limkomo because chutz limkomo is something that's shaykh to all korbanos. All korbanos, if you do Shchita, let's say a shlam, we do shchita with the intention of doing zrika chutz limkomo, that's going to be a problem. Whereas the psul of lishma is really just by chatas and korban pesach. So tomim b'shelo lishma deinu noy gela b'pesach v'chatos. So how do we know to apply mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda, even though we apply it by chutz limkomo, but chutz limkomo is something that applies globally to all korbanos? I don't know that I would necessarily apply it based on chutz limkomo to make the argument that just by chatos and korban pesach, the shelo lishmo, we would say mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda. Elo Amar Rav Ashi rather suggests Rav Ashi Yochi Komar. This is the argument to be made for Rabbi Yochanan to say mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda, by lishma. Uma b'makom shim amar hareini shoichet l'shem ploni shehu kosher lizrok damo l'shem ploni posol. Aha. Let's learn it out from Shinui Bailim. Let's learn it out by Shinui Bailim. How does Shinui Bailim work, friends? We know how Shinui Bailim works already. The way Shinui Bailim works is that, anybody want to tell us? Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam for Shimon, who also has to bring korban chatas. Now, if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas for Shimon, that is not right. That would be kosher. That would not be Shinui Bailim. Shinui Bailim is when Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam for Shimon. Well, now, therefore, if it comes to lishma, which if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas as an ola, which is already posol, certainly then, if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam as an ola, certainly it would be posol, and that's the argument to be made to say Mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda, because there's no kares there. This is not something that applies to all korbanos. It would only be posol by chatas and korban pesach. So this is the proof right here. So again, Ela Omer of Ashi rather says Rashi Achi Ka'omar. This is the argument to be made in favor of Rabbi Yochanan that Mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda, because Uma b'makom she'im Omar rini shoichet l'shem ploni shehu kosher. If Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas for Shimon, that's kosher. But lizrok damo l'shem ploni posel. But if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam for Shimon, posel. Makom she'im Omar rini shoichet shelo lishma. If he, right, in the scenario where Aharon is slaughtering Ruvain's korban chatas shelo lishma, shehu posel, and it's already posel at that point, well, shchatu al menas lizrok daman shelo lishman enudin shei posel. Well, then certainly, if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam as a korban ola, certainly it should be posel, because we would say Mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda, and this is learnt out from Shinui Bailim. And that is the argument to be made in favor of Rabbi Yochanan, that Mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda. Reb Ila, the Sruli Rish Lakish, Reb Ila, as promised, comes to support Rish Lakish that ein Mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda lo tomar bezrika v'teisi mikal v'chomer. Well, we shouldn't have to say shelo lishma by zrika and learn it out from a kal v'chomer mi benaya mishchita v'kabbalah, and learn out from shchita and kabbalah, right? If it already says by shchita and by kabbalah sadam that it has to be lishma, we can make the argument that zrika should also have to be lishma. So then why does the pasuk write that zrika needs to be lishma? To teach lomar the ein mechash me'avoda la'avoda, to say that zrika is lishma when it's stand alone. If you do the zrika shelo lishma, you throw the blood on the mizbeach shelo lishma, so then the korban, then the chatas is possible, but not when it's only in a kavana, when you're doing shchita with the kavana of zrika shelo lishma, that's not going to make things possible. That's why the Torah wrote zrika, even though, right, instead of learning it out from shchita and kabbalah, the Torah specifically wrote that zrika needs to be lishma, to say that zrika on its own needs to be lishma. Mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda, doing shchita with the kavana of zrika shelo lishma, that is not going to passel the korban. Maskiv la Rab Papa, but Rab Papa asks a question. V'dilma the Mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda. Rab Papa takes the argument, the opposite argument. Maybe the Torah is going out of its way to write that the zrika needs to be lishma, to say that, and not only zrika alone needs to be lishma, but even doing shchita with the kavana of Zerika also is going to be possible. Imkain, if that's the case, lishto kramine v'teis mekavachomer de Rav Ashi. Well, if that is the case, to say that Mechashvin me'avoda lavoda, that shchita with the kavana of Zerika shalishma is possible, then just don't write in the Torah anything about Zerika having to be lishma. Don't write anything about that, and I'll learn it out from the. And then I'll learn. Meaning, if what we're saying is Mechashvin me'avoda lavoda, well, I could just learn out from Rav Ashi's kavachomer that we had learned earlier, like 5 minutes ago, from Shinui Bailim, right? Rav Ashi at the end of the final support for Rabbi Yochanan was that if essentially by Shinui Bailim doing shchita for the korban with the intention of doing zrika for Shimon is possible, so then we said that Shinui Kodesh would also be possible. Mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda, right? That's what we learned about 5 minutes ago. So the Gemara says, look, if the Torah wanted, if we wanted to learn, if it was meant to be learned, Mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda, like Rabbi Yochanan holds, well then the Torah shouldn't have said anything at all regarding Zerika having to be the Shema. And I would learn it out from Shchita and Kabbalah. We would learn out that Zerika has to be the Shema, and then from the Kavachomer of Rav Ashi earlier by Shinui Bailim, we would also learn Mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda if it was like Rav Papa that we were meant to learn Mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda. Ve'idach, whereas Rav Papa would respond, Parich Hachi. So Rabbi Yochanan, Parich Hachi, Mad Lahanoch, Shekain, Tunis, Sofin, Vieshnan, Bichatos, Apnimios. So Rabbi Yochanan would respond that because the argument for Rish Lakish that we just said was that, well, the Torah didn't need to write that Zerika, that it didn't need to write about Lishma by Zerikas hadam, because we could have just learned it out from Shchita and Kabbalah. But Rabbi Yochanan would argue, the Torah does need to write Lishma by Zerika because we can't learn out Zerika from Shchita and Kabbalah. Why not? Friends, why can't we just automatically learn out Zerika from Shchita and Kabbalah? Because as we've learned in the past, Shchita and Kabbalah both have to be in the north of the Azar. Shchita and Kabbalah both have to be in the north of the Azar. Additionally, when you have inner Chataos, so you're not going to have Zerikas hadam on the Mizbeach HaChitzon, but you'll still have the Shchita and the Kabbalah in the north of the Azar. So because Shchita and Kabbalah are more stringent, they have to be in the north, and they also apply when there's inner Chataos, so that makes them unique, and we would be unable to learn, or more stringent, we would be unable to learn out Zerika from Shchita and Kabbalah, and therefore Rabbi Yochanan would argue that we would need that pasuk by Zerika to learn out the Shema, because we can't learn it out from Shchita and Kabbalah. So therefore, the whole argument to be made that from the fact that it didn't need to write Zerika Lishma by Zerika, but the fact that it did teaches that Ein Mechash, no, that all goes away, because Rabbi Yochanan argued that you do need to have the pasuk say Lishma by Zerika. We can't learn it out from Shchita and Kabbalah. V'idach, whereas Rish Lakish would argue back and say that you don't need the pasuk there technically, because Hashdamiyah Bishlamim Kaiminan, because when we were learning out the chiyuv of Lishma, we learned it out initially in the context of Shlamim. We weren't talking about, and Shlamim is Kachim Kalam, it doesn't need to be in the north. It wasn't talking about Chatos Apnimios, and therefore those arguments to say that Shchita and Kabbalah are more stringent because they have to be slaughtered in the north by Kachim, and because they still apply by the Chatos Apnimios, that's not shaykh to where we initially learned out Lishma from, which is from a Korban Shlam. And therefore, since those stringencies aren't shaykh to a Shlamim, then it's Rish Lakish would argue that the argument still stands to be made that the Torah didn't need to say that Zerika needs to be the Shema, and we could have learned it out from Shchita and Kabbalah. And the fact that the Torah wrote that Zerika needs to be the Shema is to teach that it needs to be the Shema alone. But Mechashvin me'avoda la'avoda, no, is not shaykh. That is the argument to be made for Reish Lakish. Okay, so again, to review al regel achas, when it comes to Mechashvin avoda lavoda, Aharon slaughtering Reuven's korban chatas with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam for Shimon, Rabbi Yochanan says possible because Mechashvin avoda lavoda. Reish Lakish says kosher, ein Mechashvin avoda lavoda. Itmar was stated shchoto lishma lizogdama shelo lishma. If Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban chatas with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam for Shimon, Rav Nachman Amar Psula. Rav Nachman says Psula like Rabbi Yochanan. Rabba Amar Kshera. Rabbi says Kshera like Reish Lakish. For other Bei Rabba Ligabe Rav Nachman Mikal Chomer de Rav Ashi. But ultimately, Rabba rescinded and held and agreed with Rav Nachman that it's Psula based on the Kal Chomer of Rav Ashi that we saw earlier, where he compared it to Shinui Bailim, which is also Mechashvin avoda lavoda, right? That if Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban chatas with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam for Shimon, that is possible. So this, and then we essentially via Kavachomer we said that the same would be true for Shinui Kodesh, that Mechashvin avoda lavoda, like Rabbi Yochanan says. Okay, now we get up to the next part of today's daf, which is also kind of exciting because I think that this is the first time that we're actually getting up to the next part of our Mishnah. I think. So we are now getting up to the next part of our Mishnah, which is slaughtering an asham shelo lishma. This was the opinion. We're going to look at the opinion now of Rabbi Eliezer. The Rabbi Eliezer Omer Afa Asham. Right? Of course, we've been talking all on and on. I don't know if that's the right phrase that I'm looking for, but we've been talking a lot about chatos and Korban Pesach, that they have to be Lishma. Comes Rabbi Eliezer, and he says, add another one to the list. Asham. In Asham that is slaughtered shelo Lishma, possible. Tanya is learned by Amr. Rabbi Eliezer says, Rabbi Eliezer, Chatos ba al chet. I believe that this was the logic that Rabbi Eliezer employed in the Mishnah. Yes. Okay. Says the Brisa, Chatas ba'al chet, a korban chatas comes for a sin, ve'asham ba'al chet, and an asham comes for a sin. Ma chatas shelo lishma psula, av asham shelo lishma pasul. Just like a korban chatas shelo lishma pasul, so an asham which also comes for a sin, shelo lishma pasul. Omar lo Rabbi Yoshua, or says Rabbi Yoshua, Loim Omar bechatos shekain dama lemaylo. Aha. Whoever who wants to explain to us what this means? So I didn't include here a diagram of the Mizbeach because I didn't think it was necessary at this point. I figured that it would suffice to say that on the Mizbeach, if you can imagine the Mizbeach with the ramp going up, that whole thing, and then the ramp is really just a ramp, right? You take the ramp up to the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach is the structure that you're walking up the ramp to. That's really where the important stuff. There's the platform on the top and the different corners, and then there's the Yesoda Mizbeach at the bottom, and this is what we're getting at, is that halfway up the Mizbeach, there is actually a red line that circumferences. Dennis, I feel like there's like a word for that that goes around it. Anyways, there is a red line that encircles. How's that? Encompasses, encircles. So there's a red line that goes around the Mizbeach, halfway up the Mizbeach. That red line is what's called the Chut HaSikra. And the significance of that red line is that there are certain korbanos whose blood is thrown, the Zerikas hadam is above the red line, above the Chut HaSikra, and most korbanos, their blood is thrown below the Chut HaSikra. The two korbanos that I'm currently aware of whose blood is thrown above the Chut HaSikra is the korban chatas Right? The korban chatas, its blood is placed by hand. It's not thrown. It's placed by hand, by fingers. I think it's placed by finger on the at the karnos hamizbeach. Right, at the top of the mizbeach there are four corners. Right, there's like four kind of horns coming up from each corner of the top of the mizbeach. So the blood, although I think we're talking to see at the end of the daf, I think today, that it is a machlokas where exactly the blood needs to be placed. But the korban chatas, certainly the blood needs to be above this red line. Similarly, a chatas ha'of, the blood is not chatas ha'of, an olas ha'of, the blood is above the chut hasikra. I believe that is correct. We're also going to get to that at the end of the daf today. So I think that the korban chatas and the olas ha'of are the two examples where the blood is above the chut hasikra. All other korbanos are below the chut hasikra. Now, back to our sugya at hand. So Rabbi Yoshua argues against Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says that both the chatos and the asham, or the asham just like the chatos, shelo lishma is possible. Rabbi Yoshua says not so fast. You can make the argument that the korban chatas is in a league of its own, that while the korban chatas shelo lishma is possible, korban asham shelo lishma is not there yet, because the korban chatas is above the chut hasikra. The korban asham is like the other korbanos, below the chut hasikra. I'm not so quick to say, says Rabbi Yeshua, that korban asham shelo lishma is possible. So again, Amar Rabbi Yeshua says Rabbi Yeshua, Lo amart b'chatas shekein dama l'mayla. Look, by korban chatas, its blood is above the chut hasikra, and also shelo lishma is psula. I'm not jumping to conclusions to say that the same would be by a korban asham whose blood is below the chut hasikra. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer responds to Rabbi Yeshua, Pesach yuchich. What about the korban Pesach? Korban Pesach, its blood is thrown below the chut hasikra, and yet, as we know, shelo lishma is psula. Shedamu lamata v'shchato shelo lishma pasul. But according to Pesach, its blood is thrown below the chut hasikra, and slaughtered shelo lishma is nonetheless pasul. So let's say that the same applies to asham. Amalor b'Yoshua mala Pesach shkin zmanu kavua. Yeah, but korban Pesach is strict in its own way, in that it has a specific window to be offered. So, okay, korban Pesach, it's strict, there's a specific window to be offered, and also shelo lishma is psula. The asham doesn't have a specific window to be offered. It's below the chut hasikra, doesn't have a specific window to be offered. So, Amar Rabbi Eliezer, chatas tuchich. Says Rabbi Eliezer, okay, but let's learn out from a korban chatas, which doesn't have a window to be offered. It could be offered any time of the year. Amar Rabbi Yoshua, chozrani chalila. Rabbi Yoshua says, okay, I see we're going in circles over here. Now, as the Gemara is going to point out in about 10-15 lines from now, normally the Gemara would say something like, well, lo rizeh krizev, lo rizeh krizev, atzad hashavet. But the Gemara doesn't do that. Instead, after Rabbi Yeshua says we're going in circles here, Rabbi Eliezer says, you know what? I'm going to try a new approach here. Rabbi Eliezer, chaz Rabbi Eliezer, vidano din acher. So Rabbi Eliezer took an alternative approach. Chatas nemer bahi. So skip the word b'shchita. We're going to skip another word in the line. It makes it a little bit better to read. And there goes to Tzionim says to skip it. It reads better without it. So chatas nemer bahi. By korban chatas, it says he lishma kshera shelo lishma psula. And we say that it needs to be kshera, it needs to be lishma, and otherwise it is psula. Ufesach nemer bo hu lishmo kosher, shlo lishmo pasul. And by korban Pesach we have hu, and it is kosher. It's only the kosher lishmo. If it's shlo lishmo, it's pasul. So for asham nemer bo hu. Well, guess what word there is by a korban asham? The magic word hu. Hu lishmo kosher, shlo lishmo pasul. It has to be lishma. If it's not lishma, it's pasul. So by chatas it says he. By korban Pesach it says who, and both by chatas and Pesach it has to be lishma. If it's shelo lishma, it's pasul. Well, guess what? Asham says who, it needs to be lishma, and if it's not, it's pasul. Amar Rabbi Yoshua, Says Rabbi Yeshua, not so fast. We saw this at the end of the daf, either yesterday or the day before. I believe the day before. I don't know, maybe yesterday. I can't remember. I don't know what's what. So Rabbi Yeshua responds, Chatas nemar ba he b'shchita he lishma ksheresh lo lishma psula. Pesach nemar ba hu b'zvicha hu lishma kosher shlo lishma pasul. Says Rabbi Yeshua, 1 second. But context is important, my friend. Rabbi Yeshua says, look, when the pasuk says he by chatas, it's in the context of shchita. When it says who in the context of Korban Pesach, it's the context of shchita. Aval asham lo nemer bahu ela la'achar aktaras emurin. But the who of asham is in the context of burning of the emurim, the selected parts on the mizbeach. Through emur of kosher, technically speaking, even if the emurim were not offered, were not burnt on the mizbeach, the kosher is still, the korban is still kosher, so long as there was the Zerikas hadam. So therefore, if Rabbi Eliezer wants to try to prove that asham needs to be lishma from the fact that it says who, just like the chatas and the pesach be'etzem have that word, context is important. Pesach and chatas have that word who, he, in the context of shchita, which is one of the 4 avodas. Asham only has who in the context of ataras emurim, which is not something that is technically ma'akev, and therefore we can't make the argument from there that shchita is that lishma is ma'akev by an asham. Amalor Rabbi Eliezer takes a third and final approach here. Harei Omer kachatos ka'asham. Okay, here we go. So this is important. Rabbi Eliezer's got something good here. Rabbi Eliezer points out that the pasuk says, I'm going to read the pasuk now. Kachatos ka'asham Torah achas loim hakoyin asher yichaper bo lo yiyeh. The pasuk says kachatos ka'asham. Well, what's the phrase I'm thinking? Like something, like something. What's the phrase like that? Like father, like son. Kachatos ka'asham. One big family. Okay, I don't know what we were comparing chatas and asham. And therefore, since the Torah juxtaposes chatas and asham, it's to say, machatas shelo lishmo pasul, af asham shelo lishmo pasul. And there, you have it. Says Rabbi Eliezer, the pasuk says, kachatas ka'asham, to compare chatas and asham. Chatas needs to be lishma, and otherwise pasul. Guess what? Asham needs to be lishma, and otherwise pasul. Okay, so as promised, Amar, we said earlier, Amalor Rabbi Yeshua Chazani Chalila. Rabbi Yeshua had said to Rabbi Eliezer, right? Rabbi Eliezer had 3 approaches to make his argument that asham that's slaughtered shelo lishma is psula. The first one was to just to say, look, if chatas comes from a sin, so does an asham. Therefore, just like chatas needs to be lishma, also asham. To which Rabbi Yeshua pointed out, yeah, but chatas is above the chuta sikra, asham isn't. Well, then let's learn it out from Korban Pesach. And basically, we said we're going in circles. So Rabbi Eliezer said, you know what? How about let's learn it out from the fact that it says who by an asham, etc. But normally the Gemara would have said, well, we're going in circles, well, let's try to learn a tzad hashaveh. If we try to learn it out from chatas, and chatas is l'mala min chutas sikra, and we try to learn it from Korban Pesach, and Korban Pesach has a specific time. So normally we'd say, lo rizeh krizeh, lo rizeh krizeh krizeh, bada bada bada, hatzad hashaveh shebayin, etc. But we didn't do that here. Rabbi Eliezer just aborted ship and says, okay, let's try a new approach. How come? So Amar, we're going in circles. Okay, but why didn't Rabbi Eliezer just say, okay, well, let's learn it out from the common denominator? Because you can ask on the common denominator, on the group of chatos and Korban Pesach, that both the chatos and the Korban Pesach have an inyan of chorus. Chatas, of course. You bring a korban chatas for davar she chayavun al zdono kares Vishigaso chatas, that's when you bring a korban chatas. So you bring a korban chatas for something that you chayiv kares for. Also, by the korban pesach, one who neglects to offer a korban pesach is chayiv kares. So both chatas and pesach have a kares element to them. That is why we can also understand why they need to be lishma. Meaning, if they need to be lishma, we can't necessarily assume that asham, which doesn't have this kares element to it, we wouldn't just assume that they have to be lishma. So that asham needs to be lishma. So if we ask the question, why not just learn out from the tzad hashava from chatos and pesach? It's because that tzad hashava is still more stringent because it has a tzad of kares, masha ein kain by asham. Amar, we said earlier, Amar Rabbi Yeshua Chazrani. Did we just read this? Yes, we did. Amar Rabbi Yeshua. So Rabbi Yeshua had said to Rabbi Eliezer, Lo, right? When Rabbi Eliezer had tried to argue that asham is posel, shelo lishma, because, well, if chatas comes for a chet and asham comes for a chet, so they should both be posel shelo lishma. And then Rabbi Yeshua said, yeah, but chatas is more stringent. Its blood is above the chut, right? It's above the chut hasikra. V'lei malei. But let Rabbi Eliezer say to Rabbi Yeshua, Lam amart bechatas shekin nichnos dama lifnai v'lifnim. Oh, okay, fine. No. Did I say no? Okay, sorry. I'm going to start over. Amar Rabbi Yeshua, Lam amart bechatas shekin dama l'malei. So Rabbi Yeshua had argued against Rabbi Eliezer that, yeah, well, chatas is more stringent, its blood goes above the chut hasikra. V'lei malei. Why instead didn't Rabbi Yeshua suggest, well, chatas is more stringent, because after all, a chatas on Yom Kippur is coming up, a korban chatas on Yom Kippur, its blood is brought into the Kodesh HaKodashim. That's some pretty stringent stuff by chatas. It's out of Asham's league. Bichatos achitzonius ka'aminun. Rabbi Eliezer would respond to that by saying, yeah, but we're just talking about outside korban chatases, right? I'm comparing asham to the chatos achitzonius, not to the chataos pnimiuses. Okay, but now, she'im nichnas dama lifnim psula. Okay, but then next question. Chatas is more stringent than asham in that if the blood of a korban chatas goes into the azara, if the blood of a korban chatas is brought into, not into the azara, is brought into the heichel, so it becomes posel, right? The pasuk says, what it says? I'm reading the pasuk, v'chol chatas asher yuva midam el oil moed lechaper b'kodesh lo yisayachel b'yish tisarif, that any korban chatas, the pasuk says, any korban chatas whose blood is brought into the heichel, so then you can't eat it, you have to burn it. So why does Rabbi Yeshua can suggest to Rabbi Eliezer that chatas is more stringent because its blood, if it goes into the heichel, the whole korban becomes posel. Well, guess what? Islei Rabbi Eliezer af ha'asham. That Rabbi Eliezer says, well, the same is true by an asham, that if the blood goes in to the heichel, it would also become posel. We're going to learn this taka at the very bottom of the daf, but we'll get to that tomorrow. Now, there's going to be a few questions now that we have to add the words v'lei malei. Okay, so there's going to be a few places where we're going to add v'lei malei. So you might see those, you might hear me adding those words. V'lei malei, shekein mechaperes al chayve kresis. Why don't we say that chatas is more stringent because, right? Why didn't Rabbi Yeshua suggest that chatas is more stringent because it's mechaper for chiyuv karises? Mechatas d'shmias hakol. Well, Rabbi Eliezer would say, well, I'm comparing asham to the chatas of shvuas ha'edus, which is not coming for a chiyuv karis. What about lema v'lei malei? Was that the word v'lei malei? I think so. V'lei malei, and let Rabbi Yeshua argue to Rabbi Eliezer shekain tuna ibra matonis, that a korban chatas is more stringent because a korban chatas blood has to be applied to all four sides. Well, it has to be applied to the korban, to the mizbeach 4 times, right? By most korbanos, we have what's called shtaim shein arba. You take the blood of the korban and you throw it once against one corner of the mizbeach. So let's say the southwestern corner of the mizbeach, and if you throw it in the corners, so memela, part of it will go to the southern side of the mizbeach, and part of it will end up on the western side of the mizbeach. And if you do the same thing on the northeastern side, so some of it will end up on the northern wall of the mizbeach, some of it will end up on the eastern wall of the mizbeach. So you have shtaim shein arba. You throw the blood twice strategically at 2 opposite corners, and by throwing the blood twice, it ends up on all 4 corners. However, by the korban chatas, you must apply the blood to the corners of the mizbeach separately, to all 4 corners. So that's a stringency by korban chatos. Well, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Eliezer holds like Rabbi Yishmael to Omar kol adamim tunin arba matanos, that Rabbi Yishmael says that actually it's not unique. This is not unique to the korban chatos. All korbanis, you have to apply the blood 4 distinct times. Okay, but v'lei malei shekein tuna al arba kronis. Okay, but still, the chatos, the blood needs to be applied to all 4 corners, right? Even according to Rabbi Yishmael, who says that the chatas, that the blood of all the korbanos needs to be applied 4 times, it doesn't necessarily mean in all 4 corners, right? You could technically apply it to 2 opposite corners, right? You can go to the southwestern corner of the mizbeach and apply once to the southern side there, and once to the western side there, and do the same thing by the northeastern side. There will be no application on the northwestern corner nor the southeastern corner. So while the korban chatas has to be applied to all 4 corners, the korban asham wouldn't. By the time now the Gemara says, hold. You keep on asking me a million different things that Rabbi Yoshua could have asked Rabbi Eliezer. Ha'ika etzba. Rabbi Yeshua could have asked Rabbi Eliezer that chatas has to be applied by the finger, whereas the other korbanos are applied by throwing it from a vessel. Ha'ika keren. The chatas has to be applied to the corners of the mizbeach, whereas the asham doesn't necessarily need to be applied to all 4 corners of the mizbeach. Ha'ika chuda, by chatas would have to be applied to the point of the corner, which is not the case by the asham. There's a million things that Rabbi Yeshua could have asked Rabbi Eliezer. Elo chad mitreitlas taime nokat. Rabbi Yeshua chose 1. So now for the final section of Daf Yud of Masechta Zevachim, Zerikas hadam for shlomim. We are going to revisit the question of, did I say shlomim? One second. Asham. Oh gosh, I'm going to have to fix that. Okay, anyways, not shlomim, asham. We are going to revisit the Zerikas hadam for asham, that it is above the chut hasikra, below the chut hasikra. Of course, it's below the chut hasikra. Maybe it should be above the chut hasikra. So let's see. We said earlier, Rabbi Yeshua. So Rabbi Yeshua had said to Rabbi Eliezer that, hey, you can't compare asham to chatas. Chatas is lemala michut hasikra. Asham is lemata. So lema le Rabbi Eliezer asham nami damu lemala. Oh. Let Reb Eliezer respond to Reb Yeshua and say, actually, Chevra, where was the proof that Reb Eliezer brought that the asham shelo lishma is possible just like the chatas shelo lishma is possible? The pasuk says, kachatas ka asham. The pasuk compares, juxtaposes, chatas is and asham is. So let's say, Let Rabbi Eliezer respond to Rabbi Yeshua and say, actually, kachatas ka'asham. Just like the chatas, the Zerikas hadam is above the chut hasikra, same thing by the asham. So when Rabbi Yeshua says, you can't compare asham to chatas is lamal michut hasikra. Let Rabbi Eliezer say, guess what? So is asham. Amar Abaye says, Abaye, asham damo l'mayla lo matzasamit. You can't say that kalvachomer ola, because after all we will make a kalvachomer from a korban ola. Uma ola she kalil, an ola which is stringent, it's entirely burnt on the mizbeach, and yet where is its blood thrown? Lemata, double lemata. Asham she'eno kalil, asham which is a more less stringent korban, well then, lo kol shekain, certainly its blood is going to be below the chut hasikra, like the ola. Mala ola shekain ena mechaperes. But one second, before you assume that ola is so strict, asham is also strict. It's mechaper. Ola can't do that. So chata sa'of tochiach. Okay, what about a chata sa'of? Right, I talked about this earlier, right? That the two things above the chut hasikra are the korban chatas and the olas ha'of. And here we see that the chatas ha'of, however, even though it's mechaper and everything, it is below the chut hasikra. So if we want to argue, yeah, but asham is mechaper, therefore it should be above the chut hasikra. Well, chatas ha'of is also, of course, mechaper, and yet it is below the chut hasikra. Malachatas ha'of shekein eino min zevach. Yeah, don't start asking me questions from chatas ha'of. Chatas ha'of is not a zevach. Zevach requires slaughter. Bird korbanos in the Beis Hamikdash require fingernails. Melika. The kohen takes his fingernail and shoves it in the back of the neck of the bird, and goodbye bird. Bye bird. So ola tochiach. Okay, well then let's try to bring the proof from the korban ola, which is a korban and it's below the chut hasikra. We will say, yeah, but ola is entirely. We said, yeah, but ola. What was the issue with ola? Oh, but ola is not mechaper. Lo rizek rizev. The nature of this is not like this. The nature of this is not like this. Hatzad hashav sheboen shen kodshei kodshim v'damun lemata afanu ovi osham sheikhu kodesh. Kodashim vidamu limato. You could say, yeah, don't bring me proof from the ola because it is not mechaber. Don't bring me proof from the chatas ha'of because it's not a zevach. But you know what? At the end of the day, you don't want this, you don't want that. The fact of the matter is, we have two examples of kodshim that are lamata michut hasikra. We're not only that, I think we said kodash or kodashim, right? Kodshim. They're lamata michut hasikra. Well, guess what? The asham also is going to be lamata michut hasikra. Omle rav mi parzakyo lirav ashi v'lifroch malat tzad hashav sheben shken ein loin kitzpa. But one second. Sure, the ola and the chatas ha'of are below the chut hasikra, but they're kind of not as serious as the asham. Why? Because the asham has a price point. An asham has to cost 2 shekels, whereas there's no such price requirement for the ola and for the chatas ha'of. And therefore, an asham, which has a kitzpah, it has a price requirement, an asham is more stringent than an ola and a chatas ha'of, and therefore its blood could be above the chut hasikra. Tomer ba'asham sheyesh lo kitzpah, right? Ola and chatas ha'of don't have price points, and an asham does. Elahainu taima de Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, this is why Rabbi Eliezer does not say that the asham is above the chut hasikra. Tomer kra hakoin amchate osa. That by the korban chatas, it says that the kohen who is throwing the blood of the korban chatas osa it. Osa dama lemala ve'ein damu shel acher lemala. That specifically when it comes to korban chatos, its blood is above the chut hasikra, not the korban asham yochi chatas nami osa lishma ksher shelo lishma psula. But one second, hashar Zevachim ben lishman ben shelo lishman ksherin. But one second, we also see osa in the context of lishma, and nonetheless, Rabbi Eliezer has no problem saying that asham has that same requirement. Meaning, it says osa by korban chatas lishma. So we should say, and we do say, we have said in the past that osa, specifically a korban chatas, needs to be lishma, not other korbanos. Other korbanos, if they're not lishma, they're still ksherin. And nonetheless, Rabbi Eliezer says, yeah, but kachatas ka'asham, asham also has the lishma requirement. So if by lishma, where it says osa, and nonetheless, Rabbi Eliezer says, well, still, asham also has that requirement. Well, let's say by the chut hasikra also that when it says akon mechate osa, and it needs to be right, it is above the chut hasikra, nothing else. But still, let Rabbi Eliezer come and say, like he said by lishma, that kachatas ka asham, and the asham is also nonetheless above the chut hasikra. How osa labdavka? Well, the difference is when it comes to lishma, that osa is leaky. It's not really literal because after all, Doshayir Pesach. After all, as we know, the Korban Pesach also has to be lishma. So therefore, the osa is not as conclusive as the osa by the blood being above the chut hasikra. Hachanami lavdavka doshayir olas haof. But 1 second, here also by the lamalim chut hasikra, it is not. What's that word that they use by the iron dome? It's not hermetic. It's also leaky. Because by above the chut hasikra, there is also olas ha'of, which is also above the chut hasikra. So it's not only the korban chatas. Yeah, but bezvicha mia lo shayir mid. Yeah, but by zvichas, by korbanis that are slaughtered, chatas is the only one above the chut hasikra. Again, a olas ha'of is not slaughtered; it is melikad. And therefore, since chatas is the only korban whose blood is above the chut hasikra, asham is not going to be able to get in there. But by lishma, which isn't really only chatas, it's also korban pesach. So there, Rabbi Eliezer would say kachatas ka asham, that the asham also there's a chiyuv of lishma. B'ibais ema. Alternatively, I can tell you why Rabbi Eliezer does not say that asham is lemala michut hasikra. Ha mani Reb Elazar Reb Shimon, that even if you do want to say that Korban Chatas isn't the only one whose blood is above the Chut HaSikra, there is also the Olas Ha'of, but this is the opinion of Reb Elazar Reb Shimon, the Amar, Hai Makum Lichud, Vai Makum Lichud. That yes, even, meaning if you want to say that, well, Chatas Ha'of isn't alone, there's also Olas Ha'of, yes, but they are in different areas. They're in different sections. The Tanya is one of the brayos. Domim atachtonim nitonin michut hasikra ud lemata. The Tanakama says that all lower bloods are below the chut hasikra, ve'alyonim michut hasikra lemala, and upper bloods are above the chut hasikra. So meaning, whether we're talking about the chatas, whether we're talking about the olas ha'of, anywhere above the chut hasikra will suffice. However, Amar B'Elazar Reb Shimon, b'amid v'mamurim be'olas ha'of. The olas ha'of could be anywhere above the chut hasikra. Ava b'chatos be'ema hi atzmein naise ela al gapo shel keren. By an olas behema, the matan damim needs to be on the corners themselves. So, because korban chatas is unique in that it's the only one whose blood is on the corners of the mizbeach, well then, asham, we're not going to say kachatas ka asham over there to get asham in there as well. No, it's in a league of its own, and by an asham, its blood is going to be lamata michut hasikra. However, when it comes to lishma, where chatas really isn't the only one that must be lishma, there is also the korban pesach, which must be lishma. So kachatas ka asham could come to teach, according to Rabbi Eliezer, that asham shelo lishma is psula just like a chatas. Friends, that was Daf Yud of Masechta Zevachim. I wonder if this one was a little shorter. Maybe? I don't know. Hopefully. Alrighty. That was Daf Yud of Masechta Zevachim. We learned Mechashvin me'avodah l'avodah. That was the first big sugya of today. That if you slaughter a chatos with the intention of doing Zerikas hadam shelo lishma, Rabbi Yochanan says possible because Mechashvin me'avodah l'avodah. Rish Lakish says kosher because ein Mechashvin me'avodah l'avodah. And then we brought proofs. This way, that way, and then it sounded like we said, like Rabbi Yochanan, that it is possible. Slaughtering an asham shelo lishma. This was, of course, the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who says that not just chatas and korban pesach, but also an asham shelo lishma is psula. So Rabbi Eliezer says possible, whereas Rabbi Yeshua disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer and says an asham shelo lishma is kosher, just like our Mishnah had said. And Zerikas hadam for an asham, we said ultimately it needs to be above the chut hasikra. We suggested, well, can't you say, wouldn't Rabbi Eliezer say, kachatas ka asham, say that it should be above the chut hasikra like the chatas? No, we can't say that. No, can do. Friends, I hope you enjoyed Daf Yomi Zevachim. Enjoy the rest of your day or night or whatever. Peace.